Chen stood in the cramped kitchen of his two-bedroom apartment, washing dishes while his 7-year-old daughter Emma practiced her violin scales in the living room. The sound drifted through the thin walls, each note slightly off-key but filled with the kind of determination that made his chest tighten with pride. He glanced at the clock on the microwave. 10 minutes past 8. In 12 hours, he would walk through the doors of the prestigious Chamberlain Academy of Music to drop off his application for their adult enrichment program, a decision that had taken him 3 months to finally commit to. What he didn't know was that this single act would set in motion a series of events that would expose the Academy's deepest prejudices and transform not just his own life, but the lives of everyone connected to that institution. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus had never planned to be a single father. 5 years ago, his life looked completely different. He had been married to Sarah, an oncology nurse who worked the night shift at County General Hospital. They lived in a modest house in the suburbs with a small backyard where Emma would chase butterflies on summer afternoons. Marcus worked as a software engineer at a tech startup, the kind of job that promised stock options and unlimited growth potential. Music had been his hobby, his escape, the thing he did on weekends when the coding became too monotonous and his mind needed a different kind of challenge. He had started playing piano when he was 6 years old, growing up in a household where his mother taught music lessons in their basement and his father played saxophone in a local jazz band. Music was as natural to Marcus as breathing. By the time he was 14, he could play piano, guitar, and bass with equal proficiency. His high school music teacher had urged him to apply to conservatories, insisting that his natural ear for harmony and his ability to improvise were gifts that shouldn't be wasted on a hobby. But Marcus had watched his parents struggle financially their entire lives, cobbling together income from gigs and lessons that paid barely enough to keep the utilities on. He loved music, but he also loved the idea of financial security, of being able to support a family without worrying about whether next month's rent would get paid. So he had chosen computer science in college, taught himself to code, and buried his musical ambitions beneath layers of practical decisions. He still played at home, still felt that familiar rush when his fingers found the right chord progression, but it became something private, something he did for himself rather than for any larger purpose. Then Emma was born, and for 3 beautiful years, life felt complete. Sarah would come home from her shifts exhausted but smiling, and Marcus would have breakfast ready while Emma babbled in her high chair. They were building something together, a life that felt stable and full of possibility. The cancer diagnosis came on a Tuesday in March. Sarah had been feeling tired for months, but they had attributed it to her demanding work schedule and the chaos of raising a toddler. When she finally went to the doctor, convinced by Marcus after she fainted at work, the news hit them like a physical blow. Stage 3 ovarian cancer. Aggressive. The doctors talked about treatment options and survival rates, using percentages that felt obscene when applied to the woman Marcus loved. She fought for 18 months, enduring rounds of chemotherapy that left her weak and nauseated, surgeries that promised hope but delivered only temporary relief. Marcus took a leave of absence from work to care for her and Emma, watching his savings account dwindle while medical bills piled up despite their insurance coverage. Sarah died on a Sunday morning in October, with autumn leaves falling outside the hospital window and Emma at home with Marcus's mother because he couldn't bear to let their daughter see her mother take her final breath. In the aftermath, Marcus discovered that grief was not a single emotion but a complex ecosystem of feelings that shifted and evolved daily. Some days he felt numb, going through the motions of single parenthood like a robot programmed to pack lunches and read bedtime stories. Other days, the loss hit him with such force that he could barely stand, and he would lock himself in the bathroom while Emma watched cartoons, letting the shower run to mask the sound of his crying. The life insurance money helped, but it wasn't enough to maintain their suburban house and cover all of Emma's needs on a single income, especially since Marcus had lost his position at the startup during his leave of absence. They moved into the apartment in a less expensive neighborhood, downsizing from 3 bedrooms to 2, from a backyard to a small balcony that overlooked a parking lot. Marcus found work as a freelance web developer, taking on projects that allowed him to work from home and be available for Emma whenever she needed him. The income was inconsistent and often barely enough, but it gave him the flexibility that a traditional job couldn't offer. Music became his therapy during those dark months after Sarah's death. Late at night, after Emma fell asleep, Marcus would sit at the old Yamaha keyboard he had bought second-hand from a pawn shop and play for hours. He didn't follow sheet music or practice scales. He just played whatever came out, letting his grief and exhaustion and stubborn hope flow through his fingers into sound. Sometimes he played Sarah's favorite songs, the ones they had danced to in their kitchen when life still felt manageable. Other times he improvised, creating melodies that existed only in that moment before dissolving into the air like smoke. Emma had inherited her parents' love of music. When she was 4, she asked for a violin, inspired by a street performer they had seen playing outside a coffee shop. Marcus couldn't afford lessons from a professional teacher, but he learned enough from YouTube videos and old music theory books to teach her the basics himself. Every evening after dinner, they would practice together, Emma with her child-sized violin and Marcus accompanying her on the keyboard. It became their ritual, the thing that connected them to each other and to the memory of Sarah, who had loved listening to Marcus play. One afternoon in late summer, Marcus was scrolling through his phone while Emma practiced when he came across an advertisement for the Chamberlain Academy of Music. The academy was famous in their city, known for producing world-class musicians and hosting performances that drew audiences from across the country. Their building occupied an entire city block in the downtown arts district, a stunning facility with concert halls, practice rooms, and state-of-the-art recording studios. Marcus had driven past it countless times, always admiring the architecture but never imagining he would have any reason to go inside. The advertisement was for their adult education program, a new initiative designed to bring music instruction to older students who wanted to develop their skills outside of a traditional conservatory track. The program promised access to the academy's facilities, instruction from their faculty, and opportunities to perform in student recitals. The tuition was expensive, more than Marcus could comfortably afford, but the advertisement mentioned scholarship opportunities for students who demonstrated financial need and exceptional talent. He read through the application requirements with growing interest. They wanted a recorded audition, letters of recommendation, an essay about the applicant's musical background and goals, and financial documentation for scholarship consideration. Marcus spent the next 2 months preparing his application. He borrowed a decent camera from a friend and recorded himself playing 3 pieces that showcased different aspects of his musical ability. A classical piece by Debussy that required technical precision and delicate touch. A jazz standard that allowed him to demonstrate his improvisational skills. And an original composition he had written during those late nights after Sarah's death, a piece that somehow contained all his grief and love and determination to keep going for Emma's sake. He asked his old high school music teacher for a letter of recommendation, reaching out to her after 15 years of no contact. She remembered him immediately and wrote him a glowing endorsement. His second letter came from a client he had worked with for 3 years, a small business owner who had heard Marcus play at a company holiday party and had been amazed by his talent. The essay was the hardest part. Marcus had never been comfortable writing about himself, and trying to explain his relationship with music in a way that would impress an admissions committee felt almost impossible. He wrote draft after draft, crumpling up pages and starting over until his recycling bin overflowed with rejected attempts. Finally, he settled on honesty. He wrote about growing up in a musical household, about choosing financial security over his passion, about losing Sarah and finding his way back to himself through music. He wrote about Emma and their evening practice sessions, about how teaching her had rekindled something in him that he thought had died years ago. He wrote about wanting to become better, not to pursue some professional career, but to be worthy of the gift he had been given. When he finally submitted the application through the Academy's online portal, Marcus felt a mixture of hope and resignation. He knew the odds were against him. The Chamberlain Academy accepted fewer than 5% of their applicants, and most of those were young prodigies with impressive credentials and wealthy parents who could afford full tuition. A 38-year-old single father with no formal training beyond high school and a financial situation that screamed desperation was probably not what they had in mind when they created this program. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Still, he had tried, and that felt like something. 3 weeks later, the rejection email arrived. Marcus was making lunch for Emma when his phone chimed with the notification. He wiped his hands on a dish towel and opened the message, already bracing himself for disappointment. The email was brief and professional, thanking him for his interest in the Chamberlain Academy adult education program and informing him that they had received an overwhelming number of applications from highly qualified candidates. Unfortunately, they would not be able to offer him a place in the program at this time. They wished him the best in his musical pursuits and encouraged him to consider applying again in the future. Marcus read the email twice, feeling a dull ache settle in his chest. He had expected rejection, had told himself repeatedly not to get his hopes up, but the disappointment still stung. He set his phone down and returned to making Emma's sandwich, cutting it diagonally the way she liked and arranging apple slices on her plate. When she bounced into the kitchen asking if they could practice early today because she wanted to show him something new she had figured out, he smiled and said of course they could. That evening, as Emma sawed away at her violin with endearing enthusiasm, Marcus found himself thinking about the rejection email. Something about it had bothered him beyond the obvious disappointment. The language had been so generic, so utterly devoid of any specific feedback about his application. They hadn't mentioned his audition recording or his essay or anything that would indicate they had actually reviewed his materials with any care. It felt like a form letter, the kind of thing you sent to applicants you had dismissed after a cursory glance at their paperwork. Over the next few days, Marcus tried to let it go and focus on his work and his daughter. He had several client projects that needed attention, and Emma's second-grade teacher had sent home a note saying she was struggling with reading comprehension and might need extra help at home. But the rejection nagged at him, a small splinter of resentment that he couldn't quite remove. He found himself checking the Chamberlain Academy's website obsessively, reading through their faculty profiles and program descriptions, trying to understand what he had lacked that made him unworthy of consideration. Then, about a week after receiving the rejection, Marcus was having coffee with his neighbor Patricia, a woman in her 60s who had lived in the apartment building for 20 years and had become something of a grandmother figure to Emma. Patricia asked how his academy application had gone, and when Marcus told her about the rejection, her face darkened with recognition. "My grandson applied to their youth summer program last year," Patricia said, setting down her coffee mug with more force than necessary. "He's incredibly talented, plays clarinet like an angel, but they rejected him too. I went down there to ask why, and you know what one of the administrators told me? She said the program was designed for students from families who could contribute meaningfully to the academy's community. When I asked what that meant, she got all flustered and said it was about more than just musical ability, that they looked for students who would be a good fit for their culture." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. What does that mean, contribute meaningfully to the community? Patricia gave him a knowing look. It means they want rich families who can make donations and show up to fundraisers wearing designer clothes. They don't want scholarship students who actually need help. They want people who can afford to pay full tuition and then some. My grandson is black. And I'm not saying that's the only reason they rejected him, but I've seen the students who walk through those doors. It's not exactly diverse, if you know what I mean. Marcus didn't know what she meant. He had looked at the photos on the Academy's website, images of smiling students performing in their concert halls. The vast majority were white, impeccably dressed, playing instruments that probably cost more than Marcus's car. There were a few token students of color scattered throughout the promotional materials, but it was clear this was an institution that catered to a specific demographic. The resentment that had been simmering inside Marcus began to boil into something stronger. He thought about the hours he had spent preparing his application, the vulnerability of his essay, the hope he had allowed himself to feel. He thought about all the other applicants like him, people with genuine talent and passion who were dismissed because they didn't fit the Academy's preferred profile. It wasn't just disappointing. It was unjust. 2 weeks later, Marcus received an email that would change everything. It came from a woman named Jennifer Hartwell, who identified herself as the chair of the Chamberlain Academy's annual Gala committee. The email explained that the Academy was hosting their biggest fundraising event of the year in 6 weeks, a black-tie dinner and performance evening that would be attended by the city's cultural elite, major donors, and the Academy's board of directors. They were looking for background musicians to perform during the cocktail hour and dinner service, and they were willing to pay $200 for 3 hours of work. Marcus almost deleted the email immediately. The idea of being hired as background music for the people who had rejected his application felt like adding insult to injury. But then he thought about Emma's violin, which was getting too small for her growing frame, and the overdue electric bill sitting on his kitchen counter, and the fact that $200 would make a real difference in their lives right now. He also thought about Patricia's grandson and all the other talented people who had been dismissed by this institution's arbitrary standards. He replied to the email accepting the position. Jennifer responded within an hour with details about the event. It would be held in the Academy's grand ballroom on a Saturday evening in early October. Dress code was all black, professional but not formal since he would be staff rather than a guest. He would need to arrive 2 hours early for a sound check and would be performing light classical and jazz standards during the designated time periods. She included a suggested repertoire list but noted that he could include his own selections as long as they were appropriate for the setting. Marcus confirmed all the details and then sat back in his desk chair, an idea beginning to form in his mind. It was probably foolish. It could backfire spectacularly and accomplish nothing except embarrassing himself. But the more he thought about it, the more the idea took root and refused to let go. He had been given an opportunity, however humble, to enter the space that had rejected him. Maybe, just maybe, he could use that opportunity to prove something. Not just to the Academy and its board, but to himself and to Emma, who deserved to see her father stand up for what he believed in. He spent the next 6 weeks preparing with an intensity he hadn't felt since his early days learning to code. During the day, he worked on his freelance projects and took care of Emma. But every night after she went to bed, he practiced. Not the light classical and jazz standards on Jennifer's suggested list, though he made sure he could play all of those competently. Instead, he worked on a set of pieces that would showcase everything he was capable of, music that would demand attention rather than fade into the background. He practiced until his fingers ached and his back cramped from sitting at the keyboard for hours. He recorded himself repeatedly, listening back with a critical ear and adjusting his technique until every note was exactly where it needed to be. He worked on his stage presence, even though he would technically just be sitting at a piano in the corner of a ballroom. He wanted to be ready for whatever opportunity might present itself, however unlikely that possibility seemed. Emma noticed the change in him. "Daddy, why are you practicing so much?" she asked one evening, standing in the doorway of his small home office in her pajamas, holding the stuffed rabbit she had slept with since she was a baby. "You already play really good." Marcus turned from his keyboard and smiled at his daughter. "I'm getting ready for a special performance, sweetheart. It's important to me, and I want to do my very best." Emma padded across the room and climbed into his lap, something she was getting almost too big for but that Marcus would never discourage. "Will I get to hear you play?" "Not this time," Marcus said, wrapping his arms around her. "This one is for grown-ups. But I promise I'll play something just for you when I get home, okay?" She nodded against his chest, satisfied with this answer. "I think Mommy would be proud of you for practicing so hard." Marcus felt his throat tighten. He kissed the top of Emma's head and held her a little tighter. "I think so too, baby. I think so too." The night of the gala arrived with unseasonably warm weather for early October. Marcus dropped Emma off at Patricia's apartment, where she would spend the evening watching movies and eating the homemade cookies Patricia always seemed to have available. He drove downtown in his aging Toyota, watching the city lights grow brighter as he approached the Arts District. The Chamberlain Academy building rose before him, its glass facade illuminated from within, looking like a palace from some modern fairy tale. He parked in the lot designated for event staff and vendors, then walked around to the main entrance carrying his suit jacket over one arm. Other musicians were arriving too, he noticed, some carrying instrument cases, others empty-handed like him since they would be using the Academy's equipment. A young woman with a violin case smiled at him as they walked through the door together. "First time playing one of these gala events?" she asked. Marcus nodded. "You?" "Third year in a row," she said cheerfully. "The pay is decent and sometimes the food is amazing if you can sneak bites between sets. Just don't expect anyone to actually listen to what you're playing. These people are here to see and be seen, not to appreciate music." They checked in at a table near the entrance where a harried-looking woman with a clipboard confirmed their names and handed them badges that said event staff in large letters. Marcus was directed to the ballroom, where he would be performing during the cocktail hour on the Academy's grand piano, a beautiful Steinway that sat on a raised platform near the bar area. Other musicians were setting up around the room, a string quartet in one corner, a harpist near the entrance to the dinner area, a jazz trio that would play during the meal service. The ballroom itself was stunning, with high ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered views of the city skyline. Round tables covered in white linens filled the space, each set with china and glassware that probably cost more than Marcus paid in monthly rent. Floral arrangements that must have required an entire greenhouse to produce served as centerpieces. Everything about the space screamed wealth and exclusivity. Marcus made his way to the piano and sat down on the bench, adjusting it to the right height and testing the pedals. The instrument was perfectly maintained, its keys responding with a sensitivity that his cheap Yamaha keyboard could never match. He ran through a few scales to warm up and check the acoustics of the space. The sound was gorgeous, rich and full without being overwhelming. This was an instrument worthy of concert halls, not background music for wealthy donors who wouldn't pay attention anyway. Jennifer Hartwell appeared beside him, wearing an elegant navy dress and carrying the same clipboard he had seen earlier. "You must be Marcus," she said, extending her hand. "Thank you so much for agreeing to perform tonight. As I mentioned in the email, we're looking for light classical and jazz, nothing too demanding of attention. Think elevator music but classier." Marcus shook her hand and nodded, not trusting himself to respond to that description with anything other than sarcasm. "You'll play from 7 to 8:30 during cocktail hour," Jennifer continued, consulting her clipboard. "Keep the volume moderate, and if you could avoid anything too dramatic or loud, that would be perfect. We want people to be able to converse easily. Your payment will be available at the check-in table when you finish." She hurried off to address some crisis with the floral arrangements, leaving Marcus alone at the piano. He pulled out his phone and checked the time. 6:15. He had 45 minutes before guests would start arriving. He could see the catering staff making final preparations, adjusting table settings and filling water glasses. Security personnel were stationed at various points around the room, serious-looking men and women in dark suits with earpieces. At 7 o'clock precisely, the doors opened and guests began flowing into the ballroom. They arrived exactly as Marcus had imagined them, dripping with wealth and self-importance. The men wore expensive tuxedos and designer watches that caught the light. The women glided across the marble floors in gowns that probably cost thousands of dollars, their jewelry understated but unmistakably real. They air-kissed and laughed and spoke in the particular tone of people who had never worried about money in their lives. Marcus began playing as the first guests approached the bar. He started with exactly what Jennifer had requested, unobtrusive classical pieces that blended into the background. Debussy's Clair de Lune played softly. A simplified version of Bach's Prelude in C major. Some light Chopin that wouldn't demand too much attention. He watched the guests as he played, observing how they moved through the space with such confidence, such certainty that they belonged here. A group of older men in tuxedos stood near his piano, discussing a recent acquisition one of them had made, some painting by an artist Marcus didn't recognize. They held crystal glasses of what was probably very expensive scotch and gestured animatedly, completely oblivious to the music flowing around them. A cluster of women in their 50s examined the auction items displayed on tables along one wall, fundraising opportunities that included vacation packages to exotic locations and dinners with famous musicians. Marcus recognized some faces from the Academy's website. The director, Dr. Harrison Blackwood, a distinguished-looking man in his 60s with silver hair and an air of authority that probably came from decades of telling people no. Several board members whose photos appeared in the About Us section, all successful business owners or cultural leaders who served on multiple nonprofit boards. Faculty members from the Academy's various departments, slightly less formally dressed than the donors but still clearly part of this elevated world. As the cocktail hour continued, Marcus found his attention drawn to the board members in particular. They gathered in a small group near the windows, deep in conversation about something that seemed to require serious expressions and concerned nods. He caught fragments of their discussion between pieces of music. "The scholarship program is becoming unsustainable," a woman in a burgundy gown was saying. "We're spending too much money on students who can't contribute back to the institution." A balding man in his 50s agreed enthusiastically. "We need to focus on families who understand the value of what we provide, people who can support the Academy beyond just their tuition payments." Dr. Blackwood raised his hand in a calming gesture. "Let's table this discussion for the board meeting next week. Tonight is about celebrating our successes and securing commitments from our donors." They moved on to lighter topics, but Marcus had heard enough. This was exactly what Patricia had suggested, what he had suspected when he received his rejection email. The Academy wasn't interested in talent or passion or potential. They wanted students who came from the right kind of families, people who would enhance their reputation and fill their coffers. At 8:30, as his designated performance time was ending, Marcus made a decision. He was supposed to simply stop playing, collect his payment, and leave through the staff entrance. That was what a smart person would do, someone who understood their place in this hierarchy and didn't want to cause trouble. But Marcus had spent 6 weeks preparing for this moment, and he hadn't done all that work just to fade quietly into the background. He waited for a break in the conversation around him, a brief lull as guests finished their cocktails and began moving toward their assigned tables for dinner. Then, instead of playing something soft and forgettable, Marcus launched into Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, one of the most dramatic and technically demanding pieces in the classical piano repertoire. The opening chords rang out like thunder, deep and ominous and impossible to ignore. Heads turned immediately. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The entire ballroom seemed to freeze as Marcus's hands flew across the keys, attacking the piece with a ferocity that came from 6 weeks of pent-up frustration and years of suppressed talent. The music built in intensity, climbing toward the piece's famous climax with its cascading arpeggios and powerful bass notes that seemed to shake the floor. Beneath him, Marcus could feel every eye in the room on him now, could sense the shock and confusion rippling through the crowd. This was not background music. This was a declaration, a challenge, a refusal to remain invisible. Jennifer appeared at the edge of his vision, looking horrified and gesturing for him to stop, but Marcus ignored her. He was committed now, driving toward the piece's conclusion with everything he had. The final chords rang out with definitive force, and then silence fell across the ballroom like a blanket. For several seconds, nobody moved. Marcus lifted his hands from the keys and looked out at the frozen crowd. Then, slowly, applause began. Not polite background noise acknowledgement, but real applause, enthusiastic clapping that started with one person and quickly spread throughout the room. Some people were even standing, apparently moved by what they had just witnessed. Dr. Blackwood made his way through the crowd toward the piano, his expression unreadable. Marcus stood, preparing himself for whatever confrontation was about to happen. This had been a risk, and he was about to find out whether it had been worth taking. The director stopped a few feet away, studying Marcus with sharp, intelligent eyes. "That was quite a performance," he said carefully. "I don't believe that was on the approved repertoire list." Marcus met his gaze steadily. "No, sir, it wasn't. I apologize if I overstepped." Dr. Blackwood was quiet for a moment, then surprised Marcus by extending his hand. "I'm Harrison Blackwood, director of the Chamberlain Academy. I don't think we've been properly introduced, though your playing suggests you have significant training. Where did you study?" Marcus shook his hand, feeling the attention of the entire ballroom focused on their interaction. I didn't study anywhere formally, he said. I'm self-taught, mostly. I actually applied to your adult education program a few months ago. Understanding flickered across Blackwood's face. I see. And were you accepted? Marcus allowed himself a small smile. No, sir. I was not. The room had grown very quiet. People were clearly listening to this conversation, sensing there was more to this story than just a background musician who had played something unexpected. Dr. Blackwood's expression shifted to something more guarded. Well, perhaps there were circumstances that prevented your acceptance. Our standards are quite rigorous. I'm sure they are, Marcus said evenly. Though I couldn't help but overhear some of your board members earlier discussing the scholarship program. Something about focusing on students from the right kind of families, people who can contribute beyond just tuition. The color drained slightly from Blackwood's face. He glanced around at the watching crowd, clearly aware that this conversation was happening in front of his most important donors and supporters. I think perhaps you misunderstood what you heard. I don't think I did, Marcus replied, his voice calm but carrying clearly through the silent room. I think your academy has very specific ideas about what kind of students deserve opportunities, and those ideas have more to do with money and social status than actual musical ability. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some people looked scandalized. Others seemed intrigued. Jennifer was frantically whispering to security personnel, but Blackwood held up a hand to stop them. That's quite an accusation, the director said coldly. Based on what evidence exactly? Based on the fact that I submitted an application with recordings that showcased everything you just heard and more, Marcus said. Based on the fact that I received a form rejection letter that didn't contain a single piece of specific feedback. Based on watching who walks through your doors and who doesn't. Based on conversations I've had with other rejected applicants who happen to be the wrong color or from the wrong neighborhood or unable to make the kind of financial contributions you prefer. The ballroom had erupted in whispered conversations. Board members were conferring urgently. Some guests looked uncomfortable, as if they didn't want to be present for whatever confrontation was unfolding. Others leaned in closer, apparently fascinated by the drama. Dr. Blackwood's face had hardened into a mask of professional courtesy barely concealing anger. This is neither the time nor the place for this discussion. If you have concerns about our admissions process, I'd be happy to schedule a meeting during regular business hours. Why? Marcus asked. So you can explain to me privately how I don't meet your standards, how my application just wasn't quite good enough. Will you use the same language then that you use behind closed doors, about students who can't contribute meaningfully to your community? One of the board members, the woman in the burgundy gown who had been discussing scholarships earlier, stepped forward. Young man, you're making serious allegations without understanding the full context of how elite institutions must operate to maintain excellence. Marcus turned to face her. I understand that you use the word excellence as code for exclusive. I understand that you've built an institution that serves the wealthy and calls it meritocracy. And I understand that there are talented musicians all over this city who will never get through your doors because they can't afford your price of admission, financial or social. The woman's face flushed with anger. You have no idea what you're talking about. The Chamberlain Academy has served this community for 75 years. Served which community exactly? Marcus asked. Because from where I'm standing, you serve only the people already in this room, the ones who can pay for tables at your fundraising galas and make donations that get their names on plaques. You don't serve the single parents working 2 jobs who teach their kids music at home because lessons are too expensive. You don't serve the talented kids from underfunded schools who could become incredible musicians if someone gave them a chance. You serve yourselves. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Security guards had positioned themselves nearby, clearly waiting for orders to escort Marcus out. But Dr. Blackwood seemed frozen, aware that forcibly removing someone who had just played brilliantly and was now articulating criticisms that some people in the room might privately agree with could create an even bigger problem. Finally, an older man Marcus didn't recognize spoke up from the crowd. He was perhaps in his 70s, distinguished-looking with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "I'd like to hear him play something else." The request surprised everyone, including Marcus. Dr. Blackwood turned to the man with barely concealed frustration. "Mr. Wellington, I don't think that's appropriate given. I didn't ask what you thought was appropriate, Harrison," the man interrupted gently but firmly. "I'd like to hear another piece. Something of his own choosing. Then we can all make informed judgments about whether this young man's criticisms have merit." Dr. Blackwood looked like he wanted to argue but apparently thought better of contradicting whoever Mr. Wellington was. He gestured stiffly toward the piano. "By all means." Marcus returned to the bench, his heart pounding but his mind clear. He had gone this far. Might as well finish what he had started. He thought about Emma, about Sarah, about every person who had been told they weren't good enough because they didn't fit someone else's narrow definition of worthy. Then he began to play the piece he had written during those dark months after Sarah's death, the one he had submitted with his application. It started quietly, almost tentatively, a simple melody in the right hand over gentle chords in the left. Then it began to build, layers of harmony adding complexity and depth. The piece told a story without words, expressing grief and loss and the struggle to keep going when everything felt impossible. It was deeply personal, the kind of music that could only come from lived experience rather than technical training. As Marcus played, he forgot about the hostile audience and the confrontation he had just initiated. He forgot about the rejection and the anger that had brought him here. He simply let the music speak for him, trusting that it would communicate what words could not. The piece climbed toward its emotional center, a section where the melody fragmented and reformed, where dissonance resolved into unexpected beauty, where pain transformed into something like hope. When the final notes faded away, Marcus kept his hands on the keys for a moment before lifting them. He looked out at the audience and saw something he hadn't expected. Tears. Multiple people were crying openly, apparently moved by what they had just heard. Even some of the board members who had looked so hostile minutes earlier had softened expressions. Mr. Wellington was the first to speak, his voice thick with emotion. "What do you call that piece?" Marcus took a breath. "I call it After the Rain. I wrote it after my wife died, trying to find a way to explain to my daughter that sometimes beautiful things grow from painful places." The old man nodded slowly, wiping at his eyes. "It's extraordinary. You're extraordinarily. And the fact that this academy rejected you is a damned shame that reflects poorly on all of us." Now several board members were looking distinctly uncomfortable. Dr. Blackwood had gone very pale. The burgundy gown woman seemed to have lost all her earlier righteousness. Mr. Wellington turned to address the crowd. "For those who don't know me, I'm Thomas Wellington, and I've been on this academy's board longer than most of you have been alive. My family helped found this institution back in 1950, and I've watched it evolve over decades. Lately, I've become concerned that we've lost sight of our original mission. We were supposed to cultivate musical excellence wherever we found it, not just in the children of the wealthy. What I just witnessed confirms my worst fears about what this place has become." Dr. Blackwood found his voice. "Thomas, this is hardly the appropriate venue for—" "This is exactly the appropriate venue," Wellington cut him off sharply. "We're here tonight asking people to support the academy financially. Don't they deserve to know how we're actually using their money? Don't they deserve to know that we're turning away talent like this because the applicant doesn't fit our preferred profile?" He turned back to Marcus. "I'd like to see your application materials. All of them. And I'd like to invite you to meet with me personally to discuss not just admission to our adult program but potentially other opportunities. We clearly made a mistake, and I intend to correct it." Marcus felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. This was beyond anything he had imagined might happen. "I appreciate that, Mr. Wellington. But honestly, I'm not sure I want to be part of an institution that had to be publicly shamed into recognizing talent." "Fair enough," the old man said with a slight smile. "Then perhaps you can help us become the institution we should have been all along." The following 3 weeks passed in a blur that Marcus could barely process. The confrontation at the gala had created ripples that extended far beyond that single evening. Someone in the audience had recorded portions of his performance and his exchange with Dr. Blackwood, and by the next morning, the video had been shared thousands of times across social media platforms. Local news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a David versus Goliath tale of a struggling single father exposing elitism at a prestigious institution. The headline in the city's main newspaper read, "Rejected pianist crashes elite academy gala, exposes discriminatory practices." Marcus's phone had been ringing constantly with interview requests from journalists, messages from strangers offering support, and surprisingly, contact from several lawyers who thought he might have grounds for a discrimination lawsuit. He had declined most of the media attention, uncomfortable with being thrust into a spotlight he had never sought. All he had wanted was to prove a point, to force the Academy to acknowledge that their rejection of him had been based on factors other than his musical ability. The viral attention felt overwhelming and invasive, especially when reporters started showing up at his apartment building trying to get comments. Patricia had been invaluable during those chaotic days, taking Emma to school and picking her up so Marcus could avoid the cameras that occasionally lurked near their building. Emma herself was confused by all the attention, asking questions Marcus struggled to answer in age-appropriate ways. "Why are people taking pictures of our building, Daddy? Why did that lady want to talk to you about the piano?" He tried to explain that sometimes when you stand up for what's right, people pay attention, but he wasn't sure a 7-year-old could fully grasp the complexities of what had happened. The Chamberlain Academy had been forced to respond to the public outcry. Dr. Blackwood released a carefully worded statement expressing regret that Marcus's application had been rejected and announcing that the Academy would be conducting a comprehensive review of their admissions procedures to ensure fairness and transparency. The statement stopped short of admitting any wrongdoing, instead framing the situation as an unfortunate oversight that highlighted the need for institutional growth. Several board members had resigned under pressure, including the woman in the burgundy gown whose comments about scholarships had been quoted in multiple news articles. Thomas Wellington had reached out to Marcus directly, bypassing the Academy's official channels. They met at a quiet coffee shop away from downtown, where the elderly philanthropist explained his vision for reforming the institution his family had helped create. Wellington was blunt about the Academy's failures, acknowledging that it had drifted away from its founding principles and become exactly the kind of exclusive club that perpetuated inequality rather than challenged it. He wanted Marcus's help in changing that culture, not just by accepting him into the adult program but by involving him in reshaping how the Academy identified and supported talented students from all backgrounds. Marcus had listened with a mixture of skepticism and cautious hope. He appreciated Wellington's apparent sincerity, but he was also aware that one wealthy board member couldn't single-handedly transform an institution with 75 years of ingrained practices and attitudes. Still, Wellington's proposal was compelling. He wanted to establish a new scholarship fund specifically for adult learners and non-traditional students, with Marcus serving as an advisor to help develop criteria that focused purely on talent and potential rather than financial capacity or social connections. He also suggested that Marcus could teach within the Academy's outreach programs, working with students from underserved communities who showed musical promise but lacked access to quality instruction. The financial aspect of Wellington's offer was impossible to ignore. He was proposing to pay Marcus a salary for his advisory and teaching work, an amount that would significantly improve his and Emma's financial situation while still allowing him the flexibility to continue his freelance work. More importantly, Emma would receive a full scholarship to the Academy's youth program once she was old enough, ensuring that she would have opportunities Marcus had been denied. It was the kind of offer that could change their lives in fundamental ways. But accepting it meant becoming part of the institution that had rejected him, working alongside people who might resent his presence or view him as a token representative of diversity and inclusion rather than a genuinely valued contributor. Marcus spent several sleepless nights wrestling with the decision, weighing the practical benefits against his pride and his lingering anger about how he had been treated. He talked it through with Patricia, who urged him to consider what would be best for Emma in the long run. He even found himself talking to Sarah's photo on his nightstand late at night, asking for guidance from someone who could no longer provide it. In the end, Marcus decided to accept Wellington's offer, but on his own terms. He drafted a detailed proposal outlining exactly what he would and would not do, specifying that he wanted complete autonomy in how he evaluated scholarship applicants and designed outreach programs. He insisted on transparency requirements that would make the Academy's admissions data public, forcing them to demonstrate measurable progress in diversifying their student body. He demanded that any marketing materials featuring his involvement include clear statements about the Academy's commitment to accessibility and inclusion, not just vague platitudes about excellence and tradition. Wellington agreed to all of Marcus's conditions without hesitation, even seeming pleased that Marcus was approaching the arrangement with such careful consideration. They formalized the agreement through the Academy's legal team, and Marcus officially began his new role at the start of November. His first day walking through those glass doors as someone with legitimate business there rather than a rejected applicant or hired background musician felt surreal. He half expected security to stop him and ask what he was doing there, but instead, staff members nodded politely and several faculty members introduced themselves with apparent genuine interest in his work. The Academy assigned Marcus a small office in the administration wing, a space with a window overlooking the courtyard and enough room for a desk, a few chairs, and most importantly, an upright piano that Wellington had personally selected for him. The instrument wasn't as grand as the Steinway in the ballroom, but it was exponentially better than his Yamaha keyboard at home. Marcus spent his first morning just sitting in the space, trying to absorb the reality that this was actually happening, that he had somehow gone from washing dishes in his cramped apartment to having an office at the city's most prestigious music institution. His primary responsibility was reviewing applications for the new Adult Learner Scholarship Program, which had received overwhelming interest following the media coverage of Marcus's story. Hundreds of people had submitted materials, many sharing stories similar to his own about passion for music that had been sidelined by financial constraints or life circumstances. Reading through the applications was both inspiring and heartbreaking. There was the 52-year-old nurse who had taught herself cello by watching online tutorials during her lunch breaks. The 29-year-old construction worker who composed symphonies in his head while operating heavy machinery because he couldn't afford an instrument to play them on. The 65-year-old retired teacher who had always dreamed of learning jazz piano but had spent her career in savings putting 3 children through college. Each application represented a life shaped by the same societal inequalities that had nearly prevented Marcus from pursuing his own musical development. He approached the review process with the seriousness it deserved, listening carefully to every audition recording and reading every essay with full attention. Unlike the cursory evaluation he suspected his own application had received, Marcus was determined that each person would be genuinely considered based solely on their talent, dedication, and potential for growth. The selection process took several weeks. Marcus consulted with faculty members he had come to trust, asking for their input on technical aspects he might have missed. He created detailed evaluation rubrics that attempted to account for differences in access to training and resources, recognizing that raw talent often manifested differently in self-taught musicians compared to those who had received formal instruction. Eventually, he narrowed the pool down to 20 recipients who would receive full scholarships covering tuition, access to instruments and practice spaces, and a modest stipend to help offset the time commitment required for serious study. The day Marcus called each scholarship recipient to deliver the news, he found himself tearing up repeatedly. The reactions ranged from stunned silence to tearful gratitude to disbelief that this was really happening. Several people asked if it was a prank or a scam, unable to accept that someone actually wanted to invest in their musical education without any catch or hidden cost. The 52-year-old nurse cried so hard she could barely speak, finally managing to say that she had given up on this dream decades ago and never imagined she would get another chance. The construction worker kept repeating, "Are you serious? Are you really serious?" until Marcus assured him multiple times that yes, this was absolutely real. Parallel to the scholarship program, Marcus began developing the Academy's outreach initiative for young students from underserved communities. This was the work that excited him most, the opportunity to identify and nurture talent in children who might otherwise never discover their own potential. He partnered with public schools and low-income neighborhoods, offering to provide free group lessons and instrument loans to students who showed interest. The response from school administrators was enthusiastic but cautious. Many had seen well-intentioned programs from wealthy institutions fizzle out after a year or two when they failed to produce immediate measurable results or when funding priorities shifted. Marcus understood their skepticism. He had seen enough failed outreach efforts in other contexts to know that genuine impact required sustained commitment and willingness to meet communities on their own terms rather than imposing external expectations. He spent time visiting schools and community centers, talking with teachers and parents and students themselves about what kind of support would actually be useful. He learned that transportation was often a bigger barrier than cost, that evening programs worked better than weekend ones for families juggling multiple jobs, that younger siblings needed somewhere safe to be while older students attended lessons. Armed with these insights, Marcus designed a program that brought instruction directly into schools during after-school hours, eliminating transportation barriers. He recruited faculty members and advanced students from the academy to serve as instructors, carefully selecting those who demonstrated genuine enthusiasm for working with beginners and cultural sensitivity for communities different from their own. He established a lending library of instruments maintained by the academy but housed at the schools, making it possible for students to practice at home without the financial burden of purchasing equipment. The first cohort of students began in January, just after the winter break. Marcus attended the inaugural session at Jefferson Elementary, a school in a neighborhood where the median household income was less than a third of the city average. 23 children had signed up, ranging from 6 to 11 years old, most having never touched a musical instrument before. They were shy and uncertain at first, intimidated by the elegant academy students who had come to teach them and unsure whether they really belonged in a music program. Marcus introduced himself to the group, sitting casually on the edge of a desk rather than standing at the front of the room like a formal instructor. He told them about growing up without much money, about the beaten-up piano his parents had bought him, about teaching himself to play because lessons were too expensive. He told them about being rejected by the academy and about the Gala performance that had changed everything. The children listened with wide eyes, clearly surprised that an adult would share such personal information with them. Then Marcus did something that became his signature approach in all the outreach programs. He asked the children to close their eyes and think about a sound they loved, any sound at all from their everyday lives. It could be a dog barking or rain on a roof or their mother's voice calling them for dinner or the ice cream truck's melody. He waited while they thought, watching their faces scrunch up in concentration. Then he asked them to try to recreate that sound using only their voice, not worrying about whether it sounded good or musical, just trying to capture the essence of what they heard in their memory. The room exploded with noise. Children made hiccuping sounds and long sustained tones and rhythmic patterns and swooping melodies. They laughed at themselves and each other, unself-conscious in their experimentation. Marcus let it continue for several minutes before asking them to stop. "That," he said, "is music. Not the fancy kind you might hear in a concert hall, but the real fundamental thing that music comes from, which is human beings trying to share something about how we experience the world. Everything else, the instruments and the notation and the theory, those are just tools to help us share those experiences more precisely with other people." He could see the shift in the children's faces, the way they relaxed into the idea that music was something they already had inside them rather than something foreign they needed to acquire. Over the following weeks, as they began learning to play recorders and xylophones and hand drums, Marcus made sure the instruction stayed connected to that fundamental understanding. The academy students who served as instructors were initially skeptical of his approach, accustomed to traditional methods focused on technique and notation from the beginning. But they couldn't argue with the results. The Jefferson Elementary students learned quickly and enthusiastically, practicing without being told and showing up early for each session. By March, similar programs had launched at 5 more schools, reaching over 100 students total. Marcus spent several days a week visiting the various sites, observing lessons and meeting with instructors to provide feedback and support. He discovered that he loved teaching, loved seeing the moment when a struggling student suddenly understood a concept or successfully played a passage they had been working on for weeks. It reminded him of watching Emma learn, that same mixture of frustration and determination and eventual triumph that characterized any genuine learning process. The adult scholarship recipients had begun their studies in January as well, and Marcus made a point of checking in with them regularly. He knew from personal experience how intimidating it could be to enter an academic environment as a non-traditional student, surrounded by younger people who seemed naturally confident and accomplished. Several scholarship recipients struggled with imposter syndrome despite their obvious talent, convinced they didn't really belong at such a prestigious institution. Marcus met with them individually and sometimes in small groups, sharing his own ongoing struggles with feeling like he didn't fit the academy's culture and encouraging them to support each other. One recipient in particular became a close ally and friend. Her name was Diane Morrison, the 52-year-old nurse who had taught herself cello. She was black, working class, and refreshingly blunt about her observations of the academy's remaining problems despite the reforms Marcus and Wellington had initiated. Over coffee after one of her lessons, Diane told Marcus that several faculty members still treated scholarship students differently from full-tuition students, with subtle condescension that was hard to call out directly but impossible to ignore. She described being talked down to by an instructor who assumed she couldn't read music because she was self-taught, despite her having studied theory extensively on her own. She mentioned overhearing other students making dismissive comments about charity cases who supposedly lowered the academy's standards. Marcus brought these concerns to Wellington, who responded by implementing mandatory implicit bias training for all faculty and staff. The move was predictably unpopular with some instructors who insisted they didn't need such training and resented the implication that their teaching might be affected by unconscious prejudices. Dr. Blackwood, still director despite the controversies, seemed to view the entire initiative as an annoyance forced upon him by circumstances beyond his control. He complied with the board's directives but did so with obvious reluctance and minimal enthusiasm. The tension between Marcus and Blackwood simmered beneath the surface of their professional interactions. They were unfailingly polite to each other in meetings and public settings, but neither man pretended to like or trust the other. Blackwood clearly resented Marcus's presence and influence, viewing him as an interloper who had embarrassed the institution and pushed through reforms that undermined traditional standards. Marcus, for his part, believed Blackwood represented everything wrong with elite institutions and would have preferred to see him replaced entirely rather than just working around him. The situation came to a head in late March during a board meeting that Marcus attended as Wellington's guest. The meeting's agenda included a proposal from Blackwood to increase tuition for the regular programs by 15%, citing rising operational costs and the need to maintain facilities and competitive faculty salaries. Wellington argued that such an increase would further limit accessibility and contradict the Academy's stated commitment to serving a broader community. Other board members divided along predictable lines, with the older establishment figures supporting Blackwood and the newer reform-minded members siding with Wellington. Marcus listened to the debate with growing frustration. The discussion was framed entirely in terms of financial sustainability and institutional reputation, with almost no mention of educational mission or social responsibility. When Wellington invited him to share his perspective, Marcus spoke more candidly than was probably wise in such a setting. He pointed out that the proposed tuition increase would price out middle-class families who were already struggling to afford the Academy's programs, effectively ensuring that only wealthy students could access the highest quality music education. He noted that the Academy's endowment had grown substantially over the past decade through investment returns, suggesting that financial pressures were being exaggerated to justify maintaining exclusivity. Blackwood responded with barely concealed hostility, suggesting that Marcus's perspective was valuable but ultimately limited by his lack of experience in institutional management and his understandable but misguided emotional investment in access issues. The comment was clearly calculated to dismiss Marcus's concerns while maintaining a veneer of respect. Other board members shifted uncomfortably, sensing the personal animosity underlying the professional disagreement. Wellington intervened before the situation could escalate further, proposing a compromise that would implement a smaller tuition increase for families above a certain income threshold while expanding scholarship funding for those below it. The proposal passed with a narrow majority, satisfying no one completely but preventing an open rupture. As the meeting concluded, Blackwood approached Marcus with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. I hope you understand that running an institution of this caliber requires difficult decisions that might not align with idealistic visions of universal access. Marcus met his gaze steadily. And I hope you understand that maintaining caliber doesn't require maintaining barriers. Excellence and accessibility aren't mutually exclusive unless you're committed to making them so. They parted without another word, both aware that their conflict was far from resolved. Marcus left the meeting feeling drained and questioning whether his presence at the academy was actually accomplishing anything meaningful or just creating friction without substantial change. That evening, he nearly called Wellington to resign, convinced that he was fighting a losing battle against institutional inertia and entrenched resistance. But then he arrived home to find Emma practicing her violin with a determination he hadn't seen before. She had been accepted into the Academy's youth preparatory program, starting in the fall, and she was already working on pieces that would be part of her entrance evaluation. When she saw Marcus, she stopped playing and ran to him with uncontained excitement. "Daddy, guess what? My teacher at school said I'm really good and that I should think about music as a real thing I could do when I grow up. She said people can have actual jobs playing music." Marcus hugged his daughter tightly, feeling his throat constrict with emotion. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Your teacher is absolutely right. You're very talented." Emma pulled back to look at him with serious eyes. "Is it hard to have a job in music? Is that why you didn't do it for a long time?" Marcus considered how to answer honestly without burdening her with adult complexities. "It can be hard," he admitted. "Not because the music itself is too difficult, but because sometimes people make it harder than it needs to be to get the training and opportunities you need. But that's changing, slowly. And you won't have to face the same barriers I did. Because you're making it better?" Emma asked with the straightforward logic of childhood. Marcus smiled despite himself. "I'm trying to, baby. I'm definitely trying." That conversation reminded him why the struggle mattered, why working within a flawed institution was worth the frustration if it meant creating opportunities for children like Emma and the students in the outreach programs. He decided to stay, to keep pushing against resistance and working toward the incremental changes that might eventually add up to something substantial. April brought an unexpected opportunity that would test Marcus's commitment in new ways. A prominent documentary filmmaker named Rachel Torres reached out to him about a project she was developing. Torres had been following the story of Marcus's confrontation with the Academy and the subsequent reforms, and she wanted to make a feature-length documentary exploring issues of access and equity in arts education. She envisioned the film following Marcus's work over the course of a year, documenting both the successes and challenges of trying to democratize elite institutions. Marcus was immediately wary. He had declined most media attention precisely because he didn't want to become a public figure or reduce complex issues to simplistic narratives. Torres anticipated his concerns and spent several hours talking with him about her approach. She showed him her previous work, documentaries about educational inequality and social justice that avoided easy answers and respected the dignity of their subjects. She promised that the film would focus on structural issues rather than personal drama, that Marcus would have input on the final edit, and that any proceeds from the documentary would go toward expanding scholarship programs. After much deliberation and consultation with Wellington and Diane, Marcus agreed to participate. The filming began in May, with Torres and a small crew documenting various aspects of his work. They captured lessons at Jefferson Elementary, showing the progress the young students had made over several months. They filmed scholarship recipients practicing and performing, conducting interviews about their experiences at the Academy. They documented board meetings and faculty discussions, revealing the ongoing tensions between reform efforts and institutional resistance. Torres also insisted on filming Marcus at home with Emma, arguing that understanding his personal story was essential context for understanding his motivations. Marcus reluctantly agreed to limited home footage, though he was protective of Emma's privacy and careful about what aspects of their lives he allowed to be documented. The resulting scenes showed their evening practice sessions, Emma's excited chatter about her day, and quiet moments of Marcus working on compositions late at night after his daughter had gone to sleep. One sequence that would become central to the documentary's emotional core was filmed in June at the youth program recital. Emma was performing publicly for the first time, playing a simple piece she had been working on for months. Marcus sat in the audience surrounded by other parents, many of whom recognized him and offered words of support and encouragement. When Emma walked onto the small stage, looking tiny with her violin, Marcus felt his heart swell with a complicated mixture of pride and anxiety and love that parenthood had made familiar. Emma played with the earnest concentration of a child giving something her absolute best effort. She made a few small mistakes but recovered smoothly, just as Marcus had taught her to do. The piece was only 3 minutes long, but to Marcus, it contained everything he had been fighting for. His daughter, standing on a stage at an institution that would have denied her access just months ago, sharing music with an audience that appreciated her effort regardless of her technical imperfections. When she finished and took her bow, the applause was warm and genuine. Marcus was crying before he realized it, tears streaming down his face while other parents smiled at his obvious emotion. Torres captured the moment on film, the camera catching Marcus's face as he watched Emma leave the stage with a huge smile. Later, during an interview session, Torres asked him what he had been feeling in that moment. Marcus struggled to articulate it, finally saying that it felt like witnessing a possibility that hadn't existed before, like watching a door open that had been locked for generations. He said it made all the frustration and conflict and doubt worthwhile, knowing that children like Emma would grow up with opportunities that hadn't been available to their parents. The summer brought new challenges as Marcus worked to expand the outreach programs to additional schools while also developing curriculum for the scholarship recipients who would continue their studies through the break. He found himself working 60-hour weeks, exhausted but driven by a sense of urgency he couldn't quite explain. Wellington noticed and gently suggested that Marcus needed to pace himself more sustainably, reminding him that lasting change required stamina rather than just intensity. Marcus tried to slow down, to create better boundaries between work and personal time, but he struggled with the feeling that there was always more to do, more students who needed support, more systemic barriers that needed dismantling. He started seeing a therapist, something he probably should have done years earlier, to process both his current stress and the accumulated grief and trauma he had never properly addressed. The therapy sessions were difficult but helpful, forcing him to confront patterns of thinking and behavior that weren't serving him well. In August, an unexpected crisis threatened to derail everything Marcus had been building. A local television station ran an investigative report alleging financial improprieties in how the Academy managed its scholarship funds. The report suggested that money donated specifically for scholarships was being redirected to general operational expenses, with only a fraction actually reaching students. The allegations were serious and potentially devastating to the reforms Marcus and Wellington had worked so hard to implement. Marcus was blindsided by the report. He had trusted that Wellington and the board were handling the financial aspects transparently and ethically. The possibility that he had been naive, that his work was being used as cover for the kind of practices he thought he was fighting against, made him physically ill. He spent a sleepless night considering worst-case scenarios and questioning every decision he had made over the past months. The next morning, Wellington called an emergency meeting with Marcus and several board members to address the allegations. He was furious, though Marcus couldn't initially tell whether the anger was directed at the accusations or at whoever had leaked information to the media. Wellington explained that the report was based on a misunderstanding of how nonprofit accounting worked, that scholarship funds were indeed being used for their designated purpose, but that some administrative costs associated with managing those scholarships were being allocated in ways that could appear problematic if you didn't understand the full context. Marcus listened with skepticism. It sounded like the kind of explanation that powerful people offered when they got caught doing something questionable. He pressed Wellington for details, asking pointed questions about specific numbers and allocations. Wellington didn't deflect or dismiss the concerns. Instead, he walked Marcus through the actual financial documents, showing him line by line how the money was being used. He acknowledged that the accounting could have been more transparent and that the board should have communicated more clearly about administrative costs. But he insisted that no funds had been misappropriated and that every dollar donated for scholarships had ultimately supported scholarship recipients, even if some of that support came in the form of infrastructure and administrative help rather than direct tuition payments. Marcus spent 2 days reviewing financial records with an accountant Wellington hired specifically to verify the information. The accountant confirmed that while the allocation methods were complex and could be confusing to outsiders, everything appeared to be legitimate and in compliance with non-profit regulations. The television station's report had been based on partial information provided by a disgruntled former employee who had been fired for performance issues and apparently wanted revenge. The Academy released a detailed public statement addressing the allegations, including making their scholarship fund accounting more transparent than legally required. Marcus gave an interview defending the program's integrity while also acknowledging that the incident highlighted the need for clearer communication about how donations were managed. The controversy gradually faded as other news captured public attention, but it left Marcus shaken and more cautious about trusting institutional structures, even ones he was part of building. September arrived with the start of a new academic year and a sense of both continuity and change. The scholarship program entered its second year with the original 20 recipients continuing their studies and a new cohort of 15 additional students joining them. The outreach programs expanded to 3 more schools, bringing the total number of young students served to nearly 200. Emma started in the youth preparatory program, attending lessons twice a week and participating in ensemble groups with other young musicians. Marcus watched the expansion with satisfaction but also growing awareness of how fragile these gains were. Everything they had built depended on continued funding, sustained board support, and the tireless work of people who believed in the mission. Any shift in institutional priorities or economic circumstances could undermine or eliminate programs that had taken enormous effort to establish. The documentary filming continued, and Torres was now capturing the consolidated reality of the programs rather than just their promising beginnings. In October, almost exactly a year after the Gala confrontation that had started everything, the Academy hosted its annual fundraising event again. This time, Marcus attended as a guest rather than hired help, sitting at a table near the front with Wellington and several board members who had been instrumental in supporting reforms. The evening's entertainment included performances by scholarship recipients, a deliberate choice to showcase the talent that had been brought into the Academy through the new programs. Diane Morrison played a movement from a Bach cello suite with technical precision and emotional depth that silenced the room. The construction worker performed a jazz piano piece he had composed himself, demonstrating sophisticated harmonic understanding and playful improvisation. Several other scholarship recipients took turns performing, each representing a different musical tradition and personal story. The audience responded with enthusiasm that seemed genuine rather than just polite, and several attendees approached Marcus afterward to express support for the programs and offer additional donations. Dr. Blackwood gave a speech acknowledging the Academy's evolution over the past year, striking a tone that managed to suggest progress without quite admitting that previous practices had been problematic. Marcus listened with amusement, recognizing the carefully calibrated language designed to satisfy reform advocates without alienating traditionalists. When Wellington took the podium, his message was more direct, praising Marcus by name and thanking him for having the courage to challenge an institution that needed challenging. The evening concluded with a surprise announcement. Wellington revealed that he had established a permanent endowment fund specifically dedicated to supporting non-traditional students in outreach programs, ensuring that these initiatives would continue regardless of annual fundraising fluctuations or board composition changes. The fund was substantial enough to support current programs and allow for significant expansion over time. He presented Marcus with a symbolic check and a plaque recognizing his contributions, a gesture that felt simultaneously honoring and slightly embarrassing. As Marcus stood at the front of the room holding the plaque while people applauded, he thought about everything that had changed since he walked into this same ballroom a year ago to play background music for people who didn't know his name. He thought about the rejection that had felt devastating at the time but that had ultimately opened doors he hadn't known existed. He thought about all the students whose lives had been changed by programs that wouldn't exist if he hadn't been angry enough to take a risk. And he thought about Emma, sitting at home with Patricia, probably already asleep but dreaming of the music she would make tomorrow. the year ahead would bring new challenges and opportunities. The documentary would be released to film festivals and eventually to broader audiences, sparking conversations about equity in arts education across the country. Marcus would be invited to consult with other institutions interested in developing similar programs, spreading the model beyond just the Chamberlain Academy. Some initiatives would succeed beyond expectations while others would struggle or fail, teaching hard lessons about what worked and what didn't. But in that moment, standing in the ballroom where his protest had begun, Marcus allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not just hope for the future, but satisfaction with the present, appreciation for how far he and so many others had come through courage and persistence and refusing to accept that things couldn't change. 2 years later, Marcus stood backstage at Carnegie Hall, watching Emma tune her violin for their joint performance. The documentary had sparked nationwide reform in arts education. 50 institutions now replicated his programs. Dr. Blackwood had resigned, replaced by a director committed to genuine accessibility. Diane Morrison taught at the academy alongside him. The construction worker toured internationally. Tonight's benefit concert would fund scholarships at conservatories across America. Emma squeezed his hand. "Ready, Daddy?" Marcus smiled, remembering that rejection letter that had changed everything. Sometimes closed doors force you to build new ones. He walked on stage to thunderous applause, finally home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.